For the last 8 months, I told myself my son still needed time to adjust. I told myself marriage changes people. I told myself I was being too sensitive. What I didn't tell myself, what I refused to admit, was that I had already called my attorney on a Tuesday afternoon in October, sitting alone in my truck in a parking garage downtown, because I didn't want anyone in that house to hear me. They had no idea. My name is Donald. I'm 63 years old. For 31 years, I worked as a structural engineer. I designed bridges, overpasses, retaining walls, things meant to hold weight, meant to last. The irony of that is not lost on me now. My wife, Patricia, passed away 4 years ago. Ovarian cancer. We had 11 months from diagnosis to the end, and I spent every single one of those months beside her. After she was gone, the house we'd shared for 27 years felt like a place that had forgotten how to breathe. Every room held something of her reading glasses on the nightstand, the African violets she kept on the kitchen windowsill, the particular way the floorboard near the bathroom door creaked when you stepped on it just right. I didn't sell. I couldn't. My son, my only child, had moved back in about 2 years after his mother died. He was 31, between jobs, and I was glad for the company. I won't pretend otherwise. The house was too quiet, having him there. Hearing someone else move around in the kitchen in the morning, someone else's car in the driveway. It helped. More than I admitted to him at the time. He brought her with him about 3 months after he moved back. His girlfriend, she had a way of walking into a room like she'd already decided whether she liked it or not, and most rooms didn't make the cut. She was polite to me in the way that people are polite when they're performing politeness. Eye contact held half a second too long. Smiles that stopped at the cheekbones. My son thought she was wonderful. I kept my mouth shut. They got engaged that spring. I threw them a dinner, invited a few of their friends, made the pot roast recipe my wife used to make for every celebration in this family. She barely touched her plate. Said she was watching her carbs. That was fine. People have preferences. But she didn't say thank you until my son nudged her. And even then it came out flat, like a word she was reading off a card. I kept my mouth shut. They got married in September. Small ceremony, which was fine by me. I paid for the rehearsal dinner and a portion of the reception, because that's what fathers do. I danced with no one, because there was no one to dance with. And I sat at the head table and watched my son look at her the way I used to look at Patricia. And despite everything, I felt a quiet hope that maybe I was wrong about her. Maybe time would settle things. It didn't. 6 weeks after the wedding, she came to find me in the garage. I was reorganizing some of Patricia's storage boxes, things I'd been meaning to sort through for 2 years but kept avoiding. She stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and waited until I looked up. She said she and my son had been talking, and they felt the house wasn't being used efficiently. I asked her what she meant. She said the master bedroom, my bedroom, the room I had shared with my wife for over 2 decades, was really too large to be used by just one person. She said it had the en-suite bathroom and the best closet space, and she thought it made more sense for her and my son to have it. I looked at her for a moment. Then I asked where she thought I'd sleep. She said there was the guest room at the end of the hall. The guest room at the end of the hall is 110 square feet. It has a twin bed and no closet, just a wardrobe that belonged to Patricia's mother. The master bedroom is the room where I watched my wife take her last breath. It is the room where I still sleep on my side of the bed because I cannot bring myself to move to the center. I told her I'd think about it. She smiled that half smile and left. I sat down on one of Patricia's storage boxes and stayed there for a long time. I didn't bring it up with my son that night, or the next. I was hoping he would go away, that she'd moved on to some other idea, that it had been a moment of boldness that embarrassed her in retrospect. I've always been an optimist. My wife used to say I gave people more runway than they deserved. She was right. 3 weeks later, we were all at the dinner table on a Sunday. She had made pasta, which was fine. The conversation was polite and surface level, the kind we'd been having for months. And then she set down her fork and said very calmly that she and my son had decided it was time to make the bedroom arrangement official. I looked at my son. He was looking at his plate. I said I hadn't agreed to any arrangement. She said she understood that, but she thought we all needed to be practical. She was talking about the future, about space, about what the house needed to become now that it was their home too. I said it was my home, that I'd owned it for 30 years, that his mother and I had raised him in it. And then my son, who I coached Little League for 3 seasons, who I drove to school every single morning until he was old enough to drive himself, who I sat beside in a hospital waiting room at 2 in the morning when he was 19 and had broken his arm in a car accident. I still can't think about without my chest tightening. My son looked up from his plate and said, quietly but clearly, that maybe it was time for me to think about what was fair to everyone in the house. Not just to me. What was fair to everyone? I finished my pasta. I thanked her for cooking. I excused myself and went to my bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed and put my hands on my knees and stared at the window for a very long time. Then I picked up my phone and texted my attorney. His name is Frank. We've known each other for 20 years. He handled the estate when my father passed, helped me with the deed when Patricia and I refinanced, and he's the kind of man who picks up the phone when you call instead of having a paralegal call you back 3 days later. I texted him that night and said I needed a consultation. He called me the next morning. I didn't tell my son. I didn't say a word. The consultation was illuminating. The house was mine, clear and free, paid off 11 years ago. No one had any legal claim to it. No co-signers, no arrangements, nothing. Whatever was happening under my roof was a social problem, not a legal one. But Frank reminded me that social problems have a way of becoming legal ones, and he suggested I start documenting things. Dates, conversations, anything significant. He also suggested I update my estate documents, which I hadn't touched since Patricia died. I went home that afternoon and started keeping notes in a small spiral notebook I bought at the drugstore, the kind students use. I wrote down the date of her request in the garage, the date of the dinner table conversation. I wrote down exact words as best I could remember them. I kept that notebook in the glove box of my truck. Life continued. She stopped mentioning the bedroom directly, but the pressure came in other ways. She rearranged the kitchen. My kitchen. The kitchen where Patricia had organized every drawer and cabinet in a specific way for reasons I'd never thought to question and now couldn't bring myself to change without asking me. She had a friend over most afternoons, and they would sit in the living room and talk in low voices that went quiet when I walked through. She started referring to the house as our place in conversations I overheard on the phone. My son noticed none of it or pretended not to. I noticed all of it, and I said nothing. I was watching. The moment that changed everything happened on a Thursday in February. I came home earlier than expected. I still did some consulting work, a few projects a year. Nothing strenuous. And as I came through the side door from the garage, I could hear her in the kitchen on the phone. The door had barely made a sound. She didn't know I was there. I heard her say that the old man was going to have to make a decision sooner or later. That she'd been patient, but patience ran out. That once they had the master, they'd have the whole floor to themselves essentially. And then they could really settle in. That his feelings about the room were sentimental and sentiment didn't pay the mortgage. Except I noted I was the one paying the mortgage because there was no mortgage. The house was paid off. She either didn't know that or didn't care. Then she said something that I wrote down, word for word in my notebook that night. She said, "He's going to either give us the room or I'm going to make the next year of his life uncomfortable enough that he decides to leave on his own. Either way, we end up where we need to be." I stood in that hallway for another 30 seconds, not moving. Then I walked quietly back out the side door, got in my truck, and drove around for 40 minutes. When I came back, I smiled and said hello and asked what was for dinner. That weekend, I texted Frank. I won't pretend the next 2 months were easy. There's a particular kind of loneliness in living alongside people who are working against you while you eat breakfast with them every morning. I cooked my own meals most nights. I kept to my routine. I went to bed in my bedroom, every single night, and I lay there in the dark and thought about Patricia, and about the bridge I designed in 1998 that's still standing, and about the fact that I had spent 63 years building things, and I was not going to let anyone take this one. My son tried, once, to have a real conversation with me. We were in the garage on the Saturday afternoon. He was helping me move some boxes, or pretending to, mostly standing there holding one end while I did the rest. And he said, without looking at me, that he hoped things weren't too uncomfortable for me in the house. I said they were fine. He said she meant well, that she just had strong ideas about space and comfort. I looked at him for a long moment. He was 40 years old. He had his mother's eyes and my stubbornness and, apparently, a capacity for self-deception I hadn't raised him to have. I said, I know you love her. I'm not asking you to choose, but I need you to understand that this is my home, and I intend to stay in it. We can talk more when you're ready. He nodded and didn't say anything else. 2 weeks later, Frank called to tell me everything was in order. It was a Sunday again. Dinner again. She had made something with chicken. We were 20 minutes into the meal when she set down her fork. I had come to understand that this was her tell. The fork going down meant something was coming, and said that she and my son had talked, and they felt it was time to have a concrete conversation about the bedroom situation. My son looked at me, not at his plate this time. He had clearly been prepared for this. She said they'd been more than patient. She said she wasn't asking me to leave the house, just to move to the guest room. She said it was a reasonable request between family members. I said, before we get into that, I'd like to share something. I got up from the table, went to the hallway closet where I'd moved my notebook 2 weeks earlier, and came back with it and with my phone. I opened the phone to a recording app, the recording I'd made on a Thursday afternoon in February, standing in my own hallway, of a conversation I had not been part of, but had heard clearly from 8 feet away. I set the phone on the table between them. I said, I want you both to listen to about 45 seconds of this. Then we can have a concrete conversation. She started to say something. I pressed play. Her own voice came out of that phone speaker and filled the kitchen. The part about making the next year uncomfortable. The part about him leaving on his own. The part about ending up where they needed to be. The kitchen was very quiet after that. My son looked at her. She was looking at the phone. Her expression was the specific expression of someone recalibrating every story they've told themselves. I turned off the recording. I said, I've spoken with my attorney. The house is mine. There's no ambiguity about that. I have no intention of leaving, and I have no intention of moving out of my bedroom. That is not going to change. She said the recording was private, that I had no right. I said I'd recorded a conversation that took place in my home, and that Frank had assured me the legality of that in the state was not a concern. My son said her name quietly. She said nothing. I said, I don't want to make this harder than it needs to be, but I need both of you to understand, clearly and completely, where things stand. This is my house. I will treat you with respect as long as you're in it. But it is my house. I picked up my fork and finished my chicken. The following weeks were cold. She barely spoke to me, which was honestly an improvement. My son was caught somewhere between understanding and loyalty, and I gave him the space to find his footing. I wasn't angry with him, exactly. I was disappointed in the particular way you can only be disappointed in someone you love. The kind that sits in your sternum and doesn't fully dissolve. Frank sent them a formal letter 2 weeks after dinner. It wasn't threatening. It was simply a clear articulation of ownership, of my rights, and of the legal standing of our current arrangement. It also noted, very specifically, that any attempt to create conditions intended to pressure a homeowner out of their own residence had a legal name, and that name was constructive eviction, and it was something courts took seriously. She called her parents the night the letter arrived. I heard the conversation through the wall. She was crying, and she was angry, and she said several things about me that I am choosing not to repeat here. 3 weeks later, she and my son sat down with me in the living room. He did most of the talking. He said they'd been doing a lot of thinking, that they wanted to start fresh, somewhere that was theirs, that they weren't starting on uneven footing. He said he was sorry for how things had gone. He didn't look at her when he said it. She looked at her hands. I said I appreciated him telling me. I asked when they were thinking. He said, end of the month. They were gone by the 28th, the first morning alone in the house after they left. I woke up at 6, which is when I always wake up, and I made coffee in the kitchen that was organized the way Patricia had organized it. Because I'd put everything back the week before, drawer by drawer. I stood at the kitchen window with my mug and looked at the backyard. It was a Thursday. The light was coming through the oak tree the way it does in early spring, broken up and shifting. I thought about Patricia. I thought about the 27 years we'd made in that house. The sound of her reading aloud from whatever novel she was in the middle of. The smell of the African violets she'd kept on that windowsill. I'd bought new ones. 3 of them. They were small yet, but they'd grow. I thought about my son. I hoped he'd find his way. I hoped she would too, honestly. Not out of softness, but because hate is a weight, and I've been carrying enough weight for long enough. I texted him that afternoon to say his room was still his room if he ever needed it. He took 3 days to respond. He said, thanks, Dad. It wasn't much, but it was something. I'm writing this from the back porch on a Saturday morning. The oak tree is budding. The coffee is good. The house is quiet in the way that's mine, not the way that used to hollow me out. I spent 31 years engineering structures designed to bear weight without breaking. Turns out I built one of those too. I've had a lot of time to sit with what happened. Not to replay it with anger, I'm past that, but to really look at it clearly. The way you look at a blueprint after the structure is already built, trying to understand where the load actually fell. What I keep coming back to is this. Nothing that happened in that house was sudden. Not her request in the garage. Not my son's silence at the dinner table. Not the phone call I overheard on a Thursday afternoon. Every one of those moments was the result of something that had been accumulating for a long time. Choices made and not made. Words said and swallowed. Boundaries that were tested because no one had ever made them clear. I'm not exempting myself from that. I gave too much runway, as Patricia used to say. I told myself I was being patient when sometimes I was just being avoidant. I didn't want conflict in the house where I still felt her presence in every room. So I stayed quiet longer than I should have, and that quiet got mistaken for weakness. That's on me. But here's what I also know. The moment I stopped waiting for the situation to fix itself and started handling it, calling Frank, keeping that notebook, listening instead of reacting, everything shifted. Not dramatically, not overnight, but the ground became solid again under my feet. That's what clear-eyed action does. It doesn't guarantee a perfect outcome, but it gives you back your footing. My son is not a bad person. I want to say that plainly. He's a man who got caught between loyalty and love, and he chose the path of least resistance for too long. That's a failure of resolve, not of character. Resolve is something you build, like any other skill, and you usually only start building it after something costs you enough that you can't ignore the bill anymore. I think he's paying that bill now. I hope it teaches him something worth keeping. As for me, what I learned is that intelligence without courage is just a good excuse to stand still. I'm an engineer. I knew exactly what was happening in that house. I understood the forces at play, but understanding something and doing something about it are two entirely different structures, and only one of them holds weight. The African violets on the kitchen windowsill are doing well. 3 small plants, but they're putting out new leaves. Patricia would have said something about that. Some quiet observation that turned into a whole conversation. She had a way of finding meaning in small things without making it feel like a lesson. I think about Donald, the version of me from 8 months ago, sitting on a storage box in the garage staring at nothing. I want to tell that man, you already know what to do. You spent 30 years designing things built to last. Trust what you know. Make the call. The house is still standing. So am I.